Week number 8 of the NFL season is officially almost done, so in today's video, we're going to go through every single game of week number 8 and give my honest thoughts and opinions of the game. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, but let's go ahead and hop right into it. And we are going to begin with the Thursday night football matchup between the LA Rams and the Minnesota Vikings. Now, coming into this game, I did think the Minnesota Vikings were going to find a way to win this very somewhat important matchup for the Vikings. At the end of the day, you were coming off your first loss of the season and you wanted to kind of get back on the right foot of things, and for the most part I thought the Vikings looked pretty good in this game. Obviously that first half between both teams was very high scoring. It was a lot of offense, not a bunch of defense, whereas in the second half it was a little bit more defense, but I still felt like I got what I wanted to see from this Vikings team. Now I know the box score does say they lost by 10, but to add some context to it, they were down by 8 with the ball and had possession to potentially go down and maybe put up a score to tie the game. Then of course that weird face mask no call that ended up being a safety would end up playing out. Now you could say that the refs cost this Vikings team the game. I'm not necessarily going to say all that because at the end of the day, I thought the Rams deserved this win. So yeah, shout out to the Rams. They are looking like a much better team from the first couple weeks. Next up, we had a really competitive game in a game that I didn't really think was going to be as competitive between the Green Bay Packers and the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now the Packers did come out on top, which I also did predict, but as I said earlier, I didn't think it would be as close as it actually was. I want to give a little bit of some credit here to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Once Jordan Love went out, it felt like that kind of sparked up this Jaguars offense late into the game when it kind of felt like they weren't going to be able to continuously stick in this game. But despite everything they were going through, this was a team that just kept fighting and kept finding themselves in situations to potentially go out there and tie the game up or win the game possibly. What ultimately did end up killing this Jaguars team was the early section of the game, maybe that first quarter. After Jordan Love threw that interception, they go out on the field and they throw an interception right a couple of plays right after. That really hurt them because eventually the Packers will go on to score, and then it just kind of felt like you were always playing from behind. Whereas if you were able to convert off of that interception and maybe put up some points, you could have played from ahead, but you ultimately couldn't do so. The Jaguars are 2-6. Their season is basically over with, whereas the Packers look like a really good team, even if Jordan Love does miss some time. Hopefully he doesn't miss too much time. Next up, we had a very fun game between the Arizona Cardinals and the Miami Dolphins. One thing I will say about this game is the Miami Dolphins offense actually looked a lot better, but that defense still has a bunch of issues. I also do want to give credit to Call of Duty Kyler Murray for going out there on Call of Duty Black Ops 6 release day and actually looking really good today. On the day, he had over 300 passing yards to go along with 2 touchdowns, as well as a plenty of work in the ground game as well. This Cardinals team found themselves in a deficit early on. At halftime, the score was 13-7, but they just continuously just kept battling in this game, despite the fact that it felt like Miami had the momentum for most of the game. If there's any good news for this Miami Dolphins team is that you do feel like you're getting things going in the right direction. This is a relatively weak AFC, so you're not completely out of the playoff conversation, but you definitely wanted to win this game for Tua, for the fan base, and of course for your playoff hopes. If they keep playing like this and if the defense can step up and make more plays, I think they'll win a lot more games than they'll lose, but they're going to have to go on a bit of a run here if they actually do want to make the playoffs. For the Arizona Cardinals side of things, hey, you're 4-4, which is a great start to your season. You've looked good offensively. You're obviously out-talented on defense, but they're performing at a pretty high level. Hey, you just held the Dolphins with 2-27, so shout out to the Arizona Cardinals. Next up, we have the New York Jets versus the New England Patriots. Now, the New York Jets were the heavy favorite in this game for a lot of different reasons. Not necessarily because they're playing much better than the New England Patriots, but just simply because they have way more talent and more big names. Guys like Sauce Gardner, Quinnen Williams, Garrett Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Breece Hall, so many other guys. Whereas on this Patriots team, you just have a bunch of guys who aren't really household names, really outside of maybe Ramondre Stevenson, which isn't even really much of a household name in its own rights. But give credit where credit is due. This Patriots team, despite going in a bit of a deficit early in this game, found a way to win. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't perfect. I hope Drake May is okay. It was kind of a bummer that he went out with an injury because he was playing really good early on, and I really want to see him finish out this game and see if he could lead a comeback against this Jets team. But you also have to give credit to Jacoby Brissett for going in there and playing like Jacoby Brissett typically can do. Now, for the New York Jets side of things, the consistent issues of just having inconsistent play and just having bad luck is really starting to happen every single game for this team. There's plenty of blame that can get thrown around, whether it's to Aaron Rodgers, whether it's to Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, this defense, but I think a big portion of the blame has to go on the coaching staff. Listen, you wanted to put blame on how the season was going on Robert Saleh, and it hasn't been fixed. You haven't won a game since firing Robert, and I think that's on the ownership, and I think that's on the remaining coaches for not performing at a higher level. Losing to the New England Patriots is simply inexcusable, and yeah, the Jets season is completely over with. Next up, we have the biggest upset of the week between the Cleveland Browns and the Baltimore Ravens. Now, I thought personally that the Ravens were going to be able to handle business, even though Lamar doesn't perform typically well against this Browns defense. But hey, give credit where credit is due. This looked like a completely different Browns team. And hell, who would have thought putting in Jameis Winston over Deshaun Watson would actually lead to having a somewhat competent offense? It's just funny how those things work out. For starters, for Kevin Stefanski, I think it's crazy that this was never considered a few weeks before. I don't really understand what they had to lose. You are 1-6 and clearly have a talented roster. So why didn't you put Jameis Winston in like 3 or 4 weeks ago? I get it, you're paying Deshaun Watson a ton of money, but I'm going on a tangent here. Let's focus on this game. In this game, for the Ravens, it just felt like they never got their groove going, primarily in the running game. They didn't really rely on Derrick Henry like they typically have throughout the season. He only had 11 carries and had 73 yards on those carries. Now, yes, a lot of those yardage was from a couple big runs, but still, 11 carries for 73 yards is very efficient. Lamar Jackson had himself a pretty solid day, all things considered. It just felt like this offense never could find that flow state that they typically can find, where they're running RPOs, where Lamar's playing well, where Derrick Henry's playing well. It just felt like this offense couldn't really get in that rhythm. It also doesn't help when you had several key drops in this game. There was a big drop with, I think, Rashad Bateman. It might have been Nelson Aguilar, but there was a big drop there because I think the sun was in his eyes. And then late in the game, with a chance to seal the game, Kyle Hamilton had a big interception drop that would have sealed the game. I think on the next play, Jameis throws that game-winning touchdown. That's just extremely unfortunate. For the Ravens, I'm not panicking on them at all. I feel like all 3 of their losses are really just because of miscues on their end. So hopefully they can figure that stuff out, because I do want to see this team go on a big run late in the season to hopefully get home field advantage in the playoffs. But for the Browns, hey, this is a really awesome win, and it gets you firmly back into a position where you can start winning football games and feeling more confident. Are the playoffs a little bit out of reach for them? Yes, at this point you would basically have to win out, and I don't think they will, but this definitely can get your confidence going and make you feel a whole lot better. Next up, we have the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, this is really a tale of two halves. In the first half, I thought the Bengals looked really good. They dominated the first quarter. They had a big opening drive that took up a lot of clock. You kept Jalen Hurts busy. Jalen Hurts didn't look great early on. And coming into this game, I said that the team that could get more explosive plays was going to win the game. And early on, it felt like the Eagles weren't getting the same amount of explosive plays as this Bengals offense was getting. And then the second half happened, where the roles were completely reversed. I'm not saying that the Eagles had a bad first half, but it wasn't as good as the Bengals. Whereas in the second half, the Bengals had a abysmal second half, whereas the Eagles had a fantastic second half. In that second half, they were able to find their rhythm. They were running the ball effectively with Saquon. They were making deep shots to A.J. Brown. They had the big deep touchdown to Devontae Smith. And defensively, they clamped down on Jamar Chase in that offense. For the Bengals, this is an extremely disappointing loss. You haven't really beat a really good team, and you lose by 20 to what is a very good Eagles team. You're now 3-5 on the year, and even though Joe Burrow and these guys are going to continue to say that they think they can make the playoffs, you're likely going to have to somewhat come close to winning out the rest of the remainder of the season. Like, you really can only afford like maybe 2 more losses to finish the year out and still give yourself a chance to make the playoffs. And for a Bengals team that is as talented as this team is, if they were to miss the playoffs, I think we're going to look back at this week and say that that is probably the week that they could have won, and they probably maybe should have won, but they didn't. Big shout out to the Eagles though. They get a massive win against a very good Bengals team, and this team looked a lot better in this performance, primarily in the second half. Next up, we have the Texans versus the Colts. Now, I don't think I have to go in too much detail about this game, because this game felt very identical to a lot of these other performances we've seen from these teams. For the Texans perspective, you just played well. I'm worried about the Diggs injury. Of course, Nico Collins is already out, so that can definitely hurt your offense, but you ran the ball effectively with Joe Mixon. CJ Stroud had a big bounce back game, and they played Texans football. Whereas on the opposite side of things, the Colts played like how the Colts have been playing the entire season. They'll make a huge splash play here, and then they'll do something extremely idiotic. And the biggest culprit of that is, of course, Anthony Richardson. At one point, I think he was like 2 of 15, and I think think he had an interception and some fumbles. I mean, Anthony's play right now is just a little bit too wild for this Colts team to overcome. And the good news for them is that they're 4-4 and they still have a chance to make the playoffs, but they've got to get a more consistent version of Anthony Richardson, or we're going to see a heavy dose of Jonathan Taylor moving forward. Now, for the Houston Texans side of things, you're firmly in the mix to make the playoffs. You're probably going to win the division. Not a lot to talk about here. Just hopefully you can stay healthy with Diggs coming back, hopefully at some point this year, and then Nico Collins as well. Next up, the massacre between the Detroit Lions and the Tennessee Titans. This was maybe the weirdest game I've ever seen, just because one team dominated one aspect of the game so much that it led to this massive blowout. I want you guys to hear this stat. They scored 52 points and Jared Goff only threw for 85 passing yards. And it wasn't like they ran the ball all crazy on this Titans defense. Yes, they did great in the run game, but it wasn't because they ran for like 500 yards that got them the 50 points. No, it was special teams. How often have I come out on these reaction videos and said that special teams won the day? That is exactly what happened in this game. And that is, to me, almost inexcusable from this Titans team. This is a Titans team that actually has a somewhat good defense, but they didn't even get a chance in this game against the Lions. The Lions had field position advantage every single opportunity, and because they had such good special teams play, this Lions offense didn't even have to do much at all. They had like 300 plus yards of just special teams yardage. That is almost completely unheard of in my opinion. And it wasn't like this Titans offense was particularly horrible in this game. They weren't good per se, but early on, they were moving the ball down the field. They were making some nice plays. Yes, Mason Rudolph had some turnovers and there were some issues offensively, but it wasn't like they played horribly in the first half. It just felt like once this team would take a big punt return for 50 yards and a touchdown, it just demoralized the Titans team. And then eventually in the second half, that team just fell apart completely and this Lions team just beat them down in their stadium. Again, this is one of the weirdest games I've ever watched. It was super funny and super fun, but also just completely demoralizing for the Tennessee Titans because I thought they'd be a good team this year, but they're 1-6. Their season is done for. Moving on, we have the rematch between the Atlanta Falcons and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Unfortunately, the Buccaneers at this stage are just way too injured to seriously compete with a really good Falcons team. Having no Mike Evans, having no Chris Godwin, having other issues on this roster has just absolutely hurting this Baker Mayfield-led team. I do want to give some credit here though to this team. They had a chance to win this game late. They just couldn't execute, and it was likely because they didn't have the pieces necessary on offense. I thought Baker Mayfield, given the fact that he doesn't have his two number 1 and number 2 options, had himself a nice day. He did have some turnovers, but he also had 3 touchdowns and over 300 yards passing and was fairly efficient, 37-50. This is a really solid Falcons team, and they scored 26, and I thought Baker Mayfield was a big reason why they were able to stay in this game. Just unfortunate that for whatever reason, Kirk Cousins just simply has this Buccaneers defense number. Cousins again with a massive day against this Buccaneers team. No, he didn't have 500 yards, but he had over 250 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. It just feels like Kirk Cousins knows how to beat this defense. He plays such a clean version of football this Falcons team has not had since prime Matt Ryan. I'm telling you now, this Falcons team is figuring things out. I know they had a stinker last week, but man, this Falcons team, if they can really find a rhythm late in the season, they could make a deep playoff run. Not saying they're going to win the Super Bowl or anything. I would not be shocked if that Falcons team makes it to the second or even third round if they can get hot at the right time and if Kirk Cousins can stay healthy. Next up, we have the LA Chargers versus the New Orleans Saints. This was, I'm just going to be completely honest with you, pretty boring game. It was a defensive shutout basically from the Chargers. The Saints had to roll in there with Spencer Rattler and Jake Haener. The Saints were basically unwatchable on offense. They made so many mistakes, and I just want to give a big shout out to Alvin Kamara for making enough plays to make this game at least somewhat watchable. The Chargers side of things, I thought Herbert looked fantastic. He was 20 for 32 for 279 yards and 2 touchdowns, and also used his legs, which is something you don't typically see from Justin Herbert too much. This was a game where they couldn't get J.K. Dobbins going at least efficiently. He only had 57 yards on 17 carries, but this team just simply dominated the Saints defense. We'll give some credit here to that Saints defense. They held up for the first 3 quarters, but then late into the game, when the game was out of reach and that offense couldn't move the ball down the field, the Chargers were able to put a couple drives to basically completely seal the game. I feel bad for Saints fans because that start to the season, in my opinion, was not fluky. This team had a recipe for success, but then all of those guys got completely injured, and now they're 2-6, and similar to other 2-6 teams, their season's done for. And it's just unfortunate because I think this team is good if they're healthy, but they're just not healthy. Moving on, we have the Buffalo Bills versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, coming into this game, I did think the Bills were going to win. I said this is almost a must-win game for Seattle. They have got to win one of these one of these big primetime matchups versus a really good team. And yeah, they got smoked in this game. Buffalo dominated them in almost every aspect. They were running the ball effectively with James Cook. Josh Allen was making Josh Allen-like plays. He used his legs. He used his arm. I mean, it was a prototypical Buffalo Bills offensive clinic. It wasn't like this team just went on a big run or anything like that. It was spread out through the entire game. I want to give a big shout out to this Buffalo Bills offense because they looked really good. And this is probably their best performance, at least as a team so far this year against a quality opponent. Whereas for Seattle, this is just really disappointing from them. As I said earlier, when I was talking about this in my predictions video, I said that this was a massive week for the Seattle Seahawks. This is a team that hasn't really had a premier win in a long time. In my opinion, their biggest win over the last like 2 or 3 years was last week versus the Falcons, where they beat up on a really good Falcons team. I was really hopeful that this would be a week where they could take a chokehold of the division and get a big primetime win against a really good team, and they didn't. They looked horrible. Now, I do want to get this out of the way. They're dealing with some injuries. DK Metcalf didn't go in this one, which was a big reason why I felt like this offense wasn't clicking. But yeah, it's just inexcusable, man. This defense got harassed the entire day. They just couldn't stop James Cook. They couldn't stop Josh Allen. And offensively speaking, I kind of felt bad for Geno Smith. They couldn't protect him. The running game was horrendous, and it just wasn't a good game for the Seattle Seahawks. They were playing in the Seattle Stadium, and Buffalo Bills fans were almost louder than Seahawks fans. I mean, it was crazy to watch because I know Seattle as a really good fan base, and they did not show out in this performance. And this was, in my opinion, maybe the biggest disappointment of the week out of any team that I saw this week. At least a team that I respect. I respect Seattle, but man, this was super disappointing. And oh my God, I cannot wait to talk about this one. Commanders versus Chicago Bears. What a effing finish to this game. Chicago had this game on a stranglehold. I think like less than 5 seconds left in the game. They're going to have to do a Hail Mary. I'm thinking, wow, what a fantastic win for this Bears team. And what happens? Well, the Hail Mary from Jesus happens. Like, what the hell happened? Now, I'll say this. I don't think that this changes my perspective of Chicago all that much. Chicago should have won this game. I thought Caleb looked fantastic in that second half. Looked a little bit bad in the first half, but I thought he responded well, especially late in the game when they had to put a drive together. He looked great. I want to give a huge shout out to DeAndre Swift. He wasn't really going too well in the first half, but he made that big spark play that really just made and energized this offense and got them going in the right direction. But man, shout out to Jaden Daniels. This Washington team, in my opinion, basically outplayed Chicago throughout the entirety of at least like the first half. They were moving the ball down the field fairly effectively. They just couldn't convert touchdowns. They were kicking field goals. I think they scored 4 straight field goals when they were in the red zone multiple times. Whereas the Chicago team, when they got in the red zone, they typically scored. I do want to address sort of the elephant in the room. What the fuck was that end zone call where you went for an offensive lineman, like the fridge play? That was a terrible play call. I don't understand why you would run that, especially when you were down in the game. You don't run an offensive lineman up the middle unless you're up in the game, and you can afford a bad mistake because you're running an offensive lineman like he's a running back. That was a terrible play call. But man, I just can't get over the ending of this game. For Washington, I thought you played fairly well, and you maybe deserved to win the game because you played fairly well the entire game. And for it to come down to a Hail Mary play, it was extremely fun to watch. It was a crazy ending, but man, I feel bad for Chicago Bears fans because you easily could have been 5-2, but now you're 4-3, which is a big difference, at least in my opinion. Moving on to the Chiefs versus the Raiders. Now, I thought the Chiefs were going to dominate the Raiders, but I will give some credit to this Raiders team. They actually went out there and performed like they actually cared. I thought Gardner Minshew put together maybe his best game of the season. He was 24 for 30 for over 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Unfortunately for this Raiders offense, they couldn't run the ball to save their life. Again, it's kind of been a common theme all season. They just simply don't have a good running back. Alexander Madison sucks. But again, I just think you have to give a lot of respect and credit for how this Raiders offense went out there and performed in a game where they really had no business being in it. For the Chiefs, I just have a hard time thinking this Chiefs team is as good as what they just kind of plays with their food throughout the game, which is really weird, especially when you're going up against a clearly bad and inferior Raiders roster. Like, this Chiefs team will go out there and dominate a team like the Niners and beat up on the Ravens for most of the game, and then they'll have a sloppy and terrible performance against the Chargers and a sloppy, terrible performance against the Raiders. It's just really weird with this Chiefs team. I know Rashee Rice isn't there. I know Isaiah Pacheco isn't there, but it just feels like this is not the Chiefs that I'm used to, because we're used to this offense looking really good and the defense holding up their end of the deal. But in this season, it's been the defense that has looked great and the offense just putting together enough points to win games. I'm not here to throw out any propaganda that the Chiefs suck or anything like that. Again, they're my number 2 in power rankings for a reason, but it just feels like this Chiefs team isn't as good as what we've seen before, which maybe could come into play later in the season. Moving on, we had the Denver Broncos versus the Carolina Panthers. Now, Bryce Young did get the start in this game, and did Bryce Young have his big redemption game? Not really. He did play okay though. On the day, Bryce Young was 24 for 37 for 224 yards. He did have 2 touchdowns, but he also had 2 interceptions. I also think it's important that we clarify that one of those touchdowns came extremely late in the game, so it wasn't like it was a really impactful touchdown that happened. I thought Bryce Young made some really good passes. He had one to Xavier Legette that I think he dropped. It was either Xavier Legette or somebody else, but I think it was Legette, that you just simply have to convert if you're this Carolina offense. This is a team that doesn't have a dominant ground game. I think the offensive line is fine, but they don't have the playmakers on the outside. And right now, Bryce Young just isn't a good quarterback. So when you get those opportunities to have a wide open, maybe potential touchdown, you got to come down with it. For the Broncos side of things, listen, your defense dominated a bad offense. I think even Sean Payton said it himself, so it's pretty clear that this Panthers team just sucks. But, you beat this team soundly. I know the final score was 28-14, but again, that touchdown was super late. It was a basically nothing touchdown. This was basically 28-7 for most of the game. So for the Broncos, this is a quality win against a bad team. I thought Bo Nix looked fine. I thought he made some good throws, made some good decisions, didn't put this team in harm's way, which is really important for a young quarterback when you're going up against bad teams. Like, you don't want Bo Nix to go out there and have a bad stat line versus a bad team and give that team opportunities to potentially tie or win the game. In this performance, I thought Bo Nix was sharp. I thought he played a sharp game and they won the game soundly. So yeah, shout out to Bo Nix, shout out to Sean Payton. You're currently 5-3, which is just crazy to say right now. And the last game that we're going to be talking about is between the Dallas Cowboys and the San Francisco 49ers. Now, unfortunately, I cannot talk about the Steelers versus Giants because I'm recording this after the Sunday Night Football game. But if you guys do want to know my opinions of that Monday Night Football game, I'll have it on my community tab, so go ahead and check it out after the game if you are interested in my thoughts. I thought in this Cowboys-Niners game, I thought the Cowboys looked better early on. They put up 10 points in the second half. They kept this game close. The defense was playing well. They were flying around, making some big plays. But I thought it was more of what the Niners couldn't capitalize on more than what the Dallas Cowboys did. And what I mean by that is the Niners made some really big plays early on and they had plenty of opportunities, but it would be like a holding foul or it would be just some weirdness going on that they couldn't convert and make those big plays. I want to say there was it was either Kittle or Debo. I'm kind of getting my time messed up here, but there was a big touchdown or a big chunk play that happened that got called back from I think a holding penalty. And so if you take that into account, if that holding penalty doesn't happen, then what do we really think about this Cowboys performance, if you get my drift here? We'll talk about the Cowboys more first here. I thought Dak played a terrible first 3 quarters. I thought he had some good moments, especially late in the game, and I think in that second quarter he played pretty well, but he had an early interception that was really inexcusable, and then later in the game he had another interception on a teardrop throw to CeeDee Lamb that he just shouldn't have thrown. He also had 2 or 3 other interceptions that could have been caught, so those are turnover worthy plays that he just got lucky in. Now the Cowboys did make this game extremely interesting late and actually had the ball with 2.5 minutes left to potentially go out there and maybe win the game, but then they had 4 straight plays of absolute nothing and then they would lose the game eventually. I don't really feel like I have anything new to say about this Cowboys team. I've reiterated the same thing every single time the Cowboys have lost. They don't have a ground game. They're running fucking Ezekiel Elliott and Dalvin Cook out there. This is not 2017. We are not back in 2018, guys. This is terrible. Why is those guys your starters? And outside of CeeDee Lamb, there is just nobody that they can realistically get the ball to that's going to make a play. Maybe Jake Ferguson, but he's not the playmaking type. Whereas on this extremely injured Niners team, they still have guys who can make plays. They still got some really good running back depth. They still have Deebo Samuel out there, and they still have Brock Purdy who's playing clean football, and they can rely on their defense to make enough plays. I thought the Cowboys played better this week, but they still should have been blown out in this game. They put together some late touchdown drives on prevent defense to make this thing interesting, but we all know the Cowboys got outplayed for the majority of the game outside of the second quarter and some portions in the fourth. But that is going to conclude everything. Real quick, I do want to throw up my predictions that I made a couple days ago. As you can see, I got a lot of predictions right, but I wasn't perfect. And if you all enjoyed the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. But I love you guys. Peace.